to say something for like 3 minutes before that happens. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Michael Jacobson, and I'm the director of the Vera Institute of Justice. And I'd like to welcome all of you to Vera's third annual Justice Address. It's a very special occasion today because we have Eric Holder, the Attorney General of the United States, as our speaker tonight. For nearly 50 years, Vera has partnered with government officials to conceive and implement new ideas that lead to lasting solutions for people and citizens. Our current projects have a broad range. They range from working locally with New York City and New York State officials to reform our cities and states' juvenile justice systems, to providing the United Nations with meaningful global indicators around rule of law in countries around the world. We are, in essence, thinkers and risk takers in the field of justice. And we do this work because we know that reform, and especially reform and systems of justice, require both those qualities, because it's such difficult work. Our experience over the years and the places we work has taught us that justice policy does not always evolve the way we'd like it to evolve. And of course, it evolves in ways that are antithetical to the ways we'd like it to evolve. And it does that for a variety of reasons. One of those reasons is that, by and large, the public discourse around issues of crime and criminal justice can be toxic, and that can result, as we all know, in incredibly poor policy. One of the reasons we inaugurated this event 3 years ago was to at least do our part to help raise the level of thoughtful discussion and discourse around the justice issues that we, and I'm sure all of you, care about. Before bringing on Lori Robinson, who will introduce the Attorney General, I want to take just a moment to recognize two recent losses to Vera, Bobby Margolis and Neil Weiner, who both passed away this week. Bobby Margolis, and I know many of you in this room knew her, was a Vera trustee from 1980 to 2000, and an honorary trustee until her death last week. She was also a trustee of two Vera spin-offs, the Criminal Justice Agency and Housing and Services Incorporated. Bobby was a remarkable woman. She provided ideas, enthusiasm, and support for innovation on behalf of society's most vulnerable people, and she did that for her entire adult life. She was a friend and a colleague, and I will sorely miss her. Neil Weiner, Vera's research director for almost the last 3 years, also sadly and quite tragically and suddenly passed away last week. And Neil, for those of us who knew him, was a kind, delightful, warm, generous man. He was also an exceptional researcher and one of the nation's leading research methodologists. Both, sadly, will be missed by everyone at Vera. Until recently, Lori Robinson was the chair of Vera's Board of Trustees. As recently as of January 28th, when she was named Acting Assistant Attorney General and Principal Deputy Attorney General for the Department of Justice. Lori previously served as Assistant Attorney General at the Office of Justice Programs from 1993 to 2000. While she was there, she oversaw the largest increase in federal spending on criminal justice research in the nation's history. She's a very, very popular woman. She spearheaded initiatives on issues ranging from comprehensive community-based crime control to violence against women, law enforcement technology, drug abuse, and corrections. Right up until she took the job at DOJ, she was director of the Master of Science program at the University of Pennsylvania's Department of Criminology, where she did that job from 2004. I have known and worked with Lori for well over a decade, and I couldn't ask for a better, more reliable, and lovely and supportive friend and colleague. And it's my pleasure now to bring up Lori Robinson.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's really just wonderful to be here tonight. I have really missed Vera so much since coming to the Justice Department in January. Especially missed really the exceptional people on Vera's staff and board, people who are remarkable in their commitment to serving the cause of justice, tenacious in their commitment to justice, just in the tradition of Vera's founder, who is here, Herb Sturz. And I've missed our very spirited discussions, and I do mean very spirited, and I'm not going to name names, in the board discussions, but I know our board chair now at Vera, John Savarese, is very ably chairing the board. And John, I want to recognize you, too. And I especially miss the close collaboration I had with Michael Jacobson. Michael Jacobson is a very leading scholar, as many of you know, in criminal justice. But I think especially his experience as a fiscal manager and budget director in New York City is so valuable now to a nonprofit organization like Vera in the economic times that face all nonprofits. But I will also tell you one thing that I do not miss: those fundraising calls. Michael was constantly on the phone to me. Lori, you have to call the trustees. Well, I just called them for donations. Yes, you have to call them. Oh my God, I just called them for contributions. So when Eric Holder asked me to join the Justice Department and give out $3 billion in Recovery Act money, you know, it maybe wasn't as tough a decision to make. But you did not come here tonight to hear me talk about that. It is my great honor this evening to introduce our keynote speaker. Eric Holder was sworn in as the 82nd Attorney General of the United States on February 3rd, of this year. He's a veteran of the U.S. Department of Justice, having started as a career attorney in the department. He served as Deputy Attorney General under Janet Reno and as U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia. And I think it's very helpful to point out, in thinking about Vera's longtime local work, that Eric Holder's career, while it's been in the federal system, has also, he's had ample experience as a local criminal justice professional. In the District of Columbia, the U.S. Attorney is also the local DA. And as D.C. Superior Court judge, he served as a local trial judge. He grappled with local crime, with family court, with juvenile court problems, the same kinds of issues that Vera has tackled in New York City and other jurisdictions. I've known Eric Holder for many years. He's not only a practitioner in the justice system, he's someone like Vera who has fostered innovation. He wants the justice system to be effective, and he's also embraced science and evidence-based approaches. And to be frank, he has been responsible for helping reinstigate the embrace of science at the U.S. Department of Justice. He is also someone who cares about and sometimes gets angry about injustice. I have seen him at the U.S. Department of Justice pound the table in his conference room when he thought basic principles of fairness were not being observed. This is an Attorney General who cares very much about public safety, but also talks about indigent defense, who wants to address safe streets, but also cares about prisoner rehabilitation. His view, like that of Vera's founders, is a commitment to justice systems that are fair, humane, and effective for everyone. 42 years ago, the Johnson Crime Commission, chaired by former Attorney General Nick Katzenbach, who was the first of these Justice Award speakers, summed up the challenges before us. The report noted, if America is to meet the challenge of crime, it must do more, far more, than it is doing now. It must welcome new ideas and risk new actions. It must resist those who point to scapegoats, who use facile slogans about crime by habit or for selfish ends. It must recognize that the government of a free society is obliged to act not only effectively, but fairly. It must seek knowledge and admit mistakes. Eric Holder is an Attorney General whom I know shares these values and this vision and can lead America through difficult waters. Please join me now in welcoming the Attorney General of the United States.
This is my kind of audience. I did absolutely nothing so far, you know. Thank you, Lori, for that very kind introduction. I wanted to let you know that we've actually started a program at the Justice Department. We have it's called the Trustees Board of the Department of Justice. You're a member of it. And one of the duties of the trustees is to raise money for the department. So we have a call list here for you to, just kidding, Lori, just kidding. When I asked Lori to come back to the Justice Department to lead our Office of Justice programs, I was keenly aware of how much she would have to give up in order to join us. Not only did she take leave from the University of Pennsylvania, but she also had to give up her chair of Vera's Board of Trustees. Now, I know that the polite thing to do would be to apologize for taking Lori from you. Ain't gonna happen. The truth is, your loss is our big gain, and we hope that Lori stays at the Department of Justice for a long, long time. Sure. Now, it is a real privilege for me to join you this evening as the keynote speaker. Your past speakers have been Nicholas Katzenbach and James Comey, who reflected on the law after their government service. Perhaps one day I might have that same conversation with you as a former Attorney General. For now, I stand before you in a different posture to share some ideas about how I think the American people can best be served by the Department of Justice going forward. Now, the Vera Institute of Justice has been an extraordinary partner to government in the administration of justice. I thank you in particular for your work with the federal government across a range of issues, from your contributions to the National Commission to eliminate prison rape, to the administration of legal orientation programs for non-citizens in immigration proceedings. Your practical, rational, data-driven, results-oriented approach can best be described as post-partisan. In the 5 months that I have served as Attorney General, I've tried to take that same approach, and that is what I'd like to talk about this evening. How we can move past politics and past ideology in order to get smart when we deal with crime. Now, getting smart on crime requires talking honestly about which policies have worked and those that have not, without fear of being labeled as too hard, or more likely, as too soft on crime. Getting smart on crime means moving beyond useless labels and instead embracing science and data and relying on them to shape policy. And it means thinking about crime in context, not just reacting to the criminal act, but developing the government's ability to enhance public safety before the crime is committed and after the former offender is returned to society. That should be our focus. It is imperative that we get smart on crime now, for much has changed since some of our basic governing assumptions about criminal law enforcement were developed. In the middle years of the 20th century, America went through a historic increase in crime and illegal drug use. In the 1960s and the 1970s, the overall crime rate increased more than fivefold. Violent crime nearly quadrupled. The murder rate doubled. And heroin, cocaine, and other illegal drug use surged. Now, many lawmakers in the 1980s responded by declaring, in rhetoric, but also in legislation, that we needed to, quote, get tough on crime. States passed truth in sentencing laws and 3 strikes and you're outlaws. Some state parole boards became more cautious, while other states eliminated discretionary parole altogether. The federal government adopted severe mandatory minimum sentencing laws, eliminated parole, and developed the federal sentencing guidelines. The federal government and the states spent billions of dollars in new prison construction. And the result was dramatic. The number of inmates in American prisons has increased 7-fold since 1970. Today, 1 out of every 100 American adults is incarcerated, the highest incarceration rate in the world. Now, few would dispute that public safety requires incarceration, and that imprisonment is at least partially responsible for the dramatic drop in crime rates nationwide in recent decades. By 2007, the nation's violent crime rate had dropped by almost 40% from its peak in 1991. But just as everyone should concede that incarceration is part of the answer, everyone should also concede that it is not the whole answer. Simply stated, imprisonment is not a complete strategy for criminal law enforcement. To begin with, high rates of incarceration have tremendous social costs. And of course, there's also the matter of simple dollars and cents and the principle of diminishing marginal returns. Every state in the union is trying to trim budgets today. States and localities are laying off teachers and canceling sanitation department shifts. But in almost all cases, spending on prisons continues to increase. Not only is this unsustainable economically, but it is also not proving to be effective at fighting crime. For while prison building and prison spending continues to increase, public safety is not improving. Since 2003, spending on incarceration has continued to rise, but crime rates have flattened. Instead, crime rates appear to have reached a plateau and no longer respond to increases in incarceration. Well, so what can we do to lower the crime rate further, to make American communities safer, to get smarter on crime? We need new tools. And one way to develop new tools is to take several steps past getting people into prison and to consider what happens to people after they leave prison and when they re-enter society. Now, we know that offenders who have participated in the Federal Bureau of Prisons residential drug abuse treatment program are 16% less likely to be rearrested, have their supervision revoked, and be returned to prison than similar inmates who did not receive such treatment before their reentry into society. They are also less likely to use drugs once they are released. And we also know that inmates who work in prison industries are 24% less likely to commit crimes again compared to inmates who have not participated in such programs, which incidentally operate at no cost to the taxpayer. The Bureau of Prisons educational programs designed to address educational deficiencies ranging from adult basic education to high school level classes are also effective in reducing recidivism. Inmates who participated in these programs are 16% less likely to commit crime again as compared to their non-participating peers. And inmates who are released through halfway houses are more likely to be gainfully employed and therefore less likely to commit crime again. as compared to inmates who are released from prison directly into the community. Now, that recitation of statistics might not sound exciting, but what we do with it is exciting. We rely upon evidence-based methods to innovate in agriculture, in transportation, in environmental safety, and in public health. And it is my belief that the Department of Justice likewise should embrace modern evidence-based methods for developing policy. Now, in particular, it is critical that we work to develop policies rooted in data to address what happens after incarceration. For the statistics that I cited are even more compelling when coupled with another fact. Most crimes in America are committed by persons who have committed crime before. Almost 67% of former state prisoners and 40% of former federal prisoners are rearrested within 3 years. Logically, if we reduce that recidivism rate, we will directly lower the crime rate. Even a modest reduction in recidivism rates would prevent thousands of crimes, and save hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars. In other words, being smart on crime means understanding that our work does not end when prison time begins. Now, smart risk assessments can identify which offenders can safely remain in their communities and which require continued attention and more intensive supervision. Data analysis can determine which offenders pose a higher recidivism rate based on the type of crime that the offender was charged with and the offender's prior record. For example, risk assessments might determine that removing a 16-year-old, nonviolent, first-time drug offender from his family and school and placing him in a juvenile detention facility is simply a bad idea because it would actually increase the risk of recidivism and waste taxpayer dollars besides. Now, one specific area where I think we can do a much better job by looking beyond incarceration is in the ways we deal with nonviolent drug offenses. We know that people convicted of drug possession or the sales of small amounts of drugs comprise a significant portion of our prison population. Indeed, in my 30 years in law enforcement, I have seen far too many young people lose their claim to a future by committing nonviolent drug crimes. One promising, viable solution to the devastating effect of drugs on the criminal justice system and on American communities is the implementation of more drug treatment courts. Drug court programs provide an alternative to incarceration for nonviolent offenders by focusing on treatment of their underlying addictions. Program participants are placed in treatment and routinely tested for drug use, with the imposition of immediate sanctions for positive tests balanced with suitable incentives to encourage abstinence from drug use. Now, these programs give no one a free pass. They are strict, and they can be extraordinarily difficult to get through. But for those who succeed, there is the real prospect of a productive future. New York has been a leader in this area, diverting some nonviolent offenders into drug court programs and away from prison, and extending early releases to other nonviolent offenders who participate in treatment programs. And while national prison populations have consistently increased, in New York, the state prison population has dropped steadily and has 12,000 fewer inmates now than it did in 1999. And since 1999, the overall crime rate in New York has dropped 27%. Now, other states have followed New York's example. And most importantly, studies show significant reductions in rearrests from about 15 to 30 percentage points for drug court participants as compared to criminals who are simply incarcerated. Furthermore, smart criminal justice policies are not, of course, exclusively reactive. We can also use data and evidence-based methods to prevent crime before it occurs. We have models, for example, in New York's CompStat program. It uses data to map where crime is most likely to occur, deploy police to those areas to disrupt criminal activity, and evaluate the effectiveness of various enforcement strategies. We can also extrapolate from available data to identify youth that are highly at risk to commit crimes in the future. For example, it seems that children who are exposed to domestic violence at home are more at risk. Once we have identified at-risk youth, we can intervene with targeted programs. And I've asked the Department of Justice once again to make a priority of focusing on the issue of children who have been exposed to violence. There is much work to be done in this area, but the underlying premise is already clear. We need to understand crime in context in order to prevent it. And with better understanding and with more information, we can develop new approaches to old and seemingly intractable problems. Now, although this administration is still young, something that I think people tend to forget, this administration is still young. We've already started to put into practice what I believe is a data-driven, non-ideological, post-partisan approach to crime. For example, I've asked attorneys throughout the department to conduct a comprehensive, evidence-based review of federal sentencing and corrections policy. Specifically, the group is examining the federal sentencing guidelines, the department's charging and sentencing advocacy practices, mandatory minimum sentences, the crack powder cocaine sentencing disparity, and other racial and ethnic disparities in sentencing. The group is also studying alternatives to incarceration and strategies that help reduce recidivism when former offenders re-enter society. We intend to use the group's findings as a springboard for recommending new legislation that will reform the structure of federal sentencing. I've also called upon the department to focus on another part of the criminal justice system, the very difficult issue of indigent defense. Now, putting politics aside, we must address the fact that, simply put, there is a crisis in indigent defense in this country. Resources for public defender programs lag far behind other justice system programs, constituting only about 3% of all criminal justice expenditures in our nation's largest counties. In many cases, contract attorneys and assigned lawyers receive compensation that does not even cover their overhead. We know that defenders in many jurisdictions carry huge caseloads that make it difficult for them to fulfill their legal and ethical responsibilities to their clients. We hear of lawyers who cannot interview their clients properly, who cannot file appropriate motions, who cannot conduct fact investigations, or do many of the other things an attorney should be able to do as a matter of course. This growing crisis is troubling, not just because of the government's constitutional duty to ensure the right to counsel. When defendants fail to receive competent legal representation, their cases are vulnerable to costly mistakes that can take a long time to correct. Lawyers on both sides can spend years with appeals arising from technical infractions and procedural errors. When that happens, no one wins. Addressing the American Council of Chief Defenders last month, I committed to several steps to help improve the indigent defense system, including hosting a national conference with the goal of developing a set of best practices and practical solutions to the problem. I've also made it clear that this Department of Justice will use the available data to improve our handling of the forensic sciences. And yes, science is back. But to improve our handling of the forensic sciences, such as fingerprints, trace evidence, and firearms matching. We are studying a recent report from the National Academies of Science that diagnosed problems in the use of forensic sciences and suggested ways forward. And we are working with our partners in the executive branch and in Congress to act on the report's insights and its recommendations. Our goal is to ensure that forensic science is practiced at the highest level possible and always in the pursuit of truth. Now, because we put a premium on truth-seeking, because indeed this administration is committed to using the best science possible whenever possible, including in the criminal justice field, I also believe that defendants should have access to DNA evidence in a range of circumstances. DNA testing has an unparalleled ability to exonerate the wrongfully convicted, as well as to identify the guilty. Federal law already guarantees access to DNA evidence held by the federal government under specific conditions, and I hope that all states will follow the federal government's lead on this issue, regardless of what the Supreme Court has said. Many of the things that I have mentioned in these remarks are still in early stages or they are under review. There are numerous areas that I have not even mentioned. For example, the prevention and detection of economic crimes and online crimes, where we similarly can get smarter with a research-driven approach. I am already certain, however, that change is both necessary and it is possible if we are willing to make it so. Our challenges have changed with time. Prison populations are at an all-time high, and they are still climbing. Yet the crime rate is no longer declining. States are in serious financial distress, but opportunities have changed too. We are able to compare the cost and the suitability of different criminal justice strategies. We no longer must choose between more crime and more prisons. We can reduce crime rates and reduce our dependence on incarceration, and at the same time increase the integrity of our criminal justice system. We can do this, and we must do this. We can harness science, and we can harness data to tackle emerging problems, and also to preserve our foundational principles. The more we know, the better that we can do, and the more sophisticated that we can be. With the help of the scholars and the experts that are contained in this room, state and local law enforcement, corrections officials across the country, judges, victims of crime, and always with the fine work of the attorneys at the Department of Justice, there is no question that a smarter and a better criminal justice system is within our grasp. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Attorney General, and on behalf of the Vera Institute of Justice and our staff and Board of Trustees, we'd like to present you with this small token of our appreciation for your talk tonight.
Thank you.
There'll be a half hour of photos.